I tried to import something to Iran. He said, don't do it. That thing is not good because the big boys, they're gonna do that. They don't let you. So what should I do? He said, just follow the.
I'm sorry, excuse me, Carlos, sorry. I'm logged in. I don't see you logged in. Did you want me to make you a conference room? As a co-host?
We have a few people coming, but they usually show up like last minute. And we have people logging into Zoom as well.
Okay.
So you said it was Richard Moore,
Yes,
M-double,
Moore.
like a Moore, the actor or actress or actor.
Like Roger Moore, yeah,
Roger, yeah.
something like that, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
So, you know what, let me grab the speakers too, because in case if anybody has a question.
All right.
Can I ask you one short question?
In a
Not
moment,
yet.
yeah.
Not yet, okay. Oh. Just look at this.
Are the speakers on your laptop loud enough if anybody has a question?
I think so.
Okay. All right, here we go. Here's people on here.
We can test it to be sure.
Good morning.
Good morning, how are you?
Morning.
Sit here. Yeah.
Can anyone out there hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Hey, Ryan, are you back?
I am back from being a world traveler.
Well, glad to hear that.
I
Can
sur-
hear.
Yeah. I would say. Oh, cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. She's got red shoes.
I saw the bottom of the shoes is red, that's why.
Is anyone can hear us?
Yes.
You can hear us?
Yes.
Gotta be careful. My daughter picked one for me.
Oh, that's nice. Mary, how are you?
I have a tidbit of information for you today, Mary.
You
Yeah.
do? Good tidbits?
Well, I think so.
Morning.
Questions we've had.
Oh, yeah.
Sit around, Mary.
Wow, it's nice. I was gonna wear black today.
Careful, it's city dress code.
Yeah.
There's always one person though.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah,
thank
quite a few people online. That's-
Wow, okay. The RPA hasn't changed, but I'm glad we have so many people logging in today. That's great.
You know. You guys, you guys class.
That's why they want to be here, just because of me.
Yes, keep us out of trouble.
I don't hear an overwhelming response out there though.
How many meetings?
You two are sitting here in front of me, so I'm thinking I have to say that. Good morning, Sarah.
Morning, come on in.
Yeah, I think most people are probably gonna be here, so. Let's see. Give Sarah some space, maybe.
Yeah. You want me this? Yeah.
Sit by me, Sarah. It's
So
fine.
you just follow along? Or do you want to follow along through?
Sure.
So a discussion. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming today. If you can't hear me, please let me know. So a discussion we had a little while back was about transactions in which sellers are accepting RMB or foreign currency. So I finally got a response from Jeff Smetana, who is Assistant General Counsel for CRMLS. And I mentioned to him also, this is becoming a very common form of payment. So here's his response. He said, first of all, I apologize for taking so long. I want to point that out. He said, our view is that this would not be totally appropriate. For one thing, it could be perceived as a fair housing issue, and that some might consider the verbiage to indicate a preference for Chinese buyers. Further, we would not allow any other form of currency to be used for sales price or value in our system. So that would be a CRMLS violation. That's what he's suggesting. So I'm not sure offering to accept other currencies gets this person anywhere, since the payment would have to be converted to dollars first. I will open a case for this when I go from there. So now they're alerted to what's taking place. It'll be interesting to what comes of this. But I think in regards to engaging in that type of activity or suggesting or promoting the acceptance of foreign currencies outside of the United States, I think you're looking for a lot of trouble here. Besides just the fact there could be fraud and there's so many other things. And if the title insurer is not aware of it up front, they're not going to insure the transaction. So the consequences are severe. So it's going to be interesting to see what they tell us as they investigate this further. So I was happy to get some kind of response. I was surprised that they weren't aware of it to begin with. Yeah, isn't it surprising?
Well, no one probably wrote an email the way that I'm sure your email.
Isn't regulation is a new one or?
It's what now?
This one, they cannot allow other money from outside. So it's a new regulation or no?
Well, it's not that it's new regulation. The question came up, is it legal to perform that kind of activity? That's
been happening.
as it's been
I
happening.
know. So many people are doing that. So many. So
There you
many
go.
payments.
That's wrong.
A lot of people come to me like, oh, we pay 100% like RMB. It's like, well, how could that?
How can that happen, right? So I don't know if it's been proclaimed illegal to transfer money, to exchange money for property outside of the country. That's a
That
good
is totally
question.
illegal.
But they're certainly probably avoiding aspects of taxation, things of that nature. And then the biggest risk is, what if the money doesn't actually go from one party to the next, and then the transaction closes?
Who's on the hook?
Yeah, the seller doesn't get the money, right? Because it's a handshake, it seems like, between people what's going on. Then they're going to be looking at us.
And what I've heard is there's some like escrow company or they have a business in China. That's how that works.
Oh,
They're
yeah,
gonna
that's
find
my
special-
understanding also.
Special escrow company, they can do that.
That's actually happening where people are purchasing property and paying for it outside of the country?
Yes, yeah,
How is that
About
allowed?
a quarter of the properties in Irvine over the last 18 months are.
that many?
So many.
Because we have such a small number of transactions,
Mhm.
if we're closing 400 or 500 deals a month, that would be different. But I would say,
Would you get me the addresses of some of those if you've got that count? I'm gonna send it to them.
sure, that would be great.
Yeah, it's not fair to the rest of us.
And is that going through escrows here?
Well, the money doesn't go through escrow per
The
se,
transaction though, is it?
but yeah,
Escrows and title companies.
and then title companies.
So the two parties are saying, our money's been exchanged, go ahead and record.
How do
But
they pull their money out for taxes in that case?
Who knows, that's another issue. The transaction is probably reported in its full dollar amount, but is that actually the valid dollar amount because of the exchange rate at the point in time in which payment's taking place? So the implications, I don't really understand all of the implications. There's just a dramatic amount of risk, and I think it's going to become something that they're going to be looking at much more closely. Hopefully. So we don't want these things happening, especially if we're not engaging in it.
and they're selling oftentimes for higher than market value. So it's affecting our marketplace. If you've got 3 homes in one tract, oftentimes the one that closed for RMB, Chinese dollars, is a higher market price than the ones that are only accepting US dollars.
Because they want to get their money, they don't care what they have to do. They're willing to pay a premium to get their money out of country or use it somehow
Somehow.
before the government
Right, to
takes
buy
it.
an asset, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So they're protected. Yeah. And so we finally have something taking place, and we'll get those addresses. I'll send that
So
to them.
exciting.
Yeah, let's
So
see what they do
exciting.
about it. Well, once again, today's discussion about the RPA. So some of the things that obviously you've gone over and over again, but we're going to touch upon it. The disclosure regarding a real estate agency relationship. It describes for the buyer seller, for example, what the fiduciary relationship or what that relationship is between the agent and that client, the buyer and or seller. And one thing I want to point out in here is that it references in the agency disclosure that confirmation of agency is required. And under seller and buyer responsibilities, it says either the purchase agreement or a separate document will contain a confirmation in which agent is representing you, whether that agent is representing exclusively in the transaction or acting as a dual agent. So confirmation of agency actually takes place on page 1 of the purchase contract. And if it's not completed properly, you must complete it. It's statutorily required. And you would use Form CA to do that if it's not done properly. So we're going to kind of just browse over some of these things. But you can see in the center of this page, this is page 2 of the agency relationship disclosure. It's simply just an example of what confirmation of agency is going to appear like in the purchase contract. And then fair housing and discrimination advisory. If you read through this, you're going to see different things that talk about, for example, don't submit pictures, don't provide any type of information that could suggest or cause someone to act in a discriminatory manner, whether it's intentional or not. So it addresses things like that very clearly. And I don't want to go through the whole form, but rentals, things of that nature, if I'm listing a property for rent or for sale, say don't send letters and don't send pictures, because it's specifically addressed in the fair housing advisory to not do those
What
things.
about like a driver's license or an ID?
That's a picture.
Yeah, a lot of people
Don't ask
nowadays
for
are
it.
asking for it.
Yeah, don't ask for driver's licenses. Once you've granted credit to somebody, as like you're colorblind at that point in time, then you can ask for a driver's license. So it's acceptable at that point in time once you've granted credit, if it's a rental, for example. But let's not put ourselves or anybody else in an awkward position. And then possible representation of more than one buyer seller puts all parties on notice. We could be representing multiple parties. I could have 6 listings of the same type down the street. So I want you, Mr. Seller, to be aware of that. Wire fraud, it just tells people be careful. It's just advisory. When you have clients, be sure that they call escrow before wiring money. They're going to be receiving written instructions from the escrow holder. And that buyer, before they send money, should be calling escrow to confirm the information on that wire instruction as being accurate. And Mary has shared with us personal accounts of fraud that she's aware of throughout Orange County, as a matter of fact, in that regard.
Very quick, very easy.
Yeah. So the RPA, so far it hasn't changed. Who knows, it might change by the end of the year again. But the date prepared is very simple. It's just it's a reference date. So if I'm preparing the contract, I would use today's date. Of course, you can see I've used an old contract here. The date is today, the 10th, huh? It's the day before my anniversary. And then this is an offer from, and the name of the buyer is going to be inserted. I suggest using the cover sheet, by the way. And I won't go into all those details. And then we would insert the address. Some of it, once again, is very repetitive for most of us. And then section 2, agency. When initially I talked to you about the agency disclosure form, here's a representation of page 2 of the agency disclosure sitting in section 2B. So we need to complete this in its entirety. That means including all license numbers, and you need to assign your relationship with that buyer and or seller. So in this case, if it's all within the same broker's license number, it's considered to be a dual agent. You can see Mike Dunn works for the same office as Richard Moore. So it would be represented as dual agency. If we weren't under the same broker's license and Mike is a listing agent, we would simply check the box. For him, the seller, and you can see the system is smart. It already knows that if Mike is not of the same office or under the same broker's ID, then Richard Moore is not also a part of that company.
So Rich, just to clarify, dual agency is either you're representing the buyer and the seller yourself, or two people within the same brokerage are representing the buyer and the seller.
Yes, any agents under the same broker's license in a transaction is considered to be a dual agent. Okay, those are all easy things, right? Then on to the purchase contract itself, the purchase price, self-explanatory. How much are we offering? If we check the box all cash, it has repercussions or implications. If we say all cash, the loan contingency in the default language in the body of the RPA does not exist. So you're saying it is not contingent upon a loan. That does not prevent a buyer, good morning, from assuming or pursuing other forms of financing, and cash is considered a form of financing. So keep that in mind. Even though you submit an offer, it says all cash, that buyer has the right to pursue other means to close the transaction. It doesn't give them the opportunity to cancel based upon a loan contingency if they check all cash. Close it, go ahead.
It's 30 days after acceptance. You have to show the evidence of the money, right? That's the 30 days for?
No, the 30, in this case for section 3B, this is for the close of escrow. So we're saying after acceptance, and remember acceptance isn't just the date in which it's signed, it's the date following which delivery occurs. So the date following the date of the last signature. If the offer is submitted today, the buyer signs today, excuse me, the seller signs today and it's returned tomorrow, tomorrow is the date of acceptance. And that's important simply because when you look at escrow instructions, the escrow holder may not know the actual date of acceptance. It's going to affect your closing date. It's going to affect your contingency periods, so on and so forth. So that's very important.
This is how long the transaction is going to take to close. 30 days.
Yeah, if I didn't give you a clear explanation of that.
So
So,
for any reason goes more or less, you have to notify the seller's agent, right?
well, you need to have a contractual addendum or amendment to that. You just don't arbitrarily make a decision
Yeah, it's favorable.
All parties
to not close. Good morning. So what I can tell you, when you put a close of escrow in there of 30 days or a specific date, the other party expects you to close on that date. So don't even think that you have the ability to fluctuate from that time frame. It makes people very angry.
It's not a suggestion.
It's not a suggestion, right?
You signed it.
It's agreed upon. Then section 3C, expiration of offer. The expiration of the offer is 3 calendar days after all buyer signatures. So if on a Wednesday, the buyers sign the offer, and on Saturday, the seller doesn't return it, on Sunday, the contract expires. All right. So before acceptance, the termination or execution of event can terminate on a weekend or legal holiday. So keep that in mind. Initial deposit amount, I put 3% in there, $30,000. The 3% is simply just a function of the initial deposit divided by the purchase price. And if you notice, it states in parentheses, the percentage number above is for calculation purposes only. It is not a contractual term. So what is that saying? If my purchase price goes from $1 million to $2 million, my initial deposit does not change. There's no obligation for the buyer to increase the initial deposit in a pro rata manner. And then to the right of that, in the initial deposit amount, this is the only aspect of the purchase contract in which we count business days. So remember, you have 3 business days following acceptance to deposit the money. That's a long time. Think about it. Acceptance falls on a Thursday, then that buyer has until the following Monday to deposit the money. So yes, so we exclude weekends or legal holidays. So the timing is dramatically different. That might be something you may consider changing.
And Rich, 3% is standard, right, for people submitting an offer right now.
But so it seems, at least in this marketplace, if you want to get their attention, if you decide to deposit more, anything over 3% of the purchase price is not subject to liquidated damages. So even if there's a dispute, the seller, for example, could not hold up that additional money. The buyer would be entitled to the return of that differential. But it seems like if it's competitive, yeah, you should probably give consideration to going up to a 3% deposit. I would suggest that strongly. And then section D2, which is 3D2, increased deposit. It's kind of a rare event, but we could actually increase the deposit maybe upon reaching certain milestones. In this case, upon maybe removal of contingencies. The loan amount, now because I have all cash checked, you can see loan amount is actually not an available field for me. But I'm going to remove the all cash. And the loan amount field becomes available. In this case, I'm putting 80% down or $800,000. Now, unlike the initial deposit, if the purchase price goes up to $2 million, now my loan amount is going to adjust on a pro rata manner. It would then be $1.6 million, right? 80% of the purchase price, so exact opposite. It will fluctuate with the purchase price. And then section E1, this is part of a protection clause for the buyer. I suggest that you fill it in. So the contract defaults to fixed or conventional financing. That is the default form of financing that's being pursued in the contract. We can say adjustable if we want, we're not going to. And then the not to exceed % for the interest rate. It is a protection clause for the buyer. So let's assume rates are fluctuating dramatically. The buyer qualifies at 7 and up to 7.5. Well, or actually they want the seller to choose their offer because if rates fluctuate higher, the buyer is going to be willing to pay a higher interest rate and still go forward. But if rates go to 10% and we put a cap in here of 7.25, the buyer does not have to go forward. So don't be too aggressive in that regard because listing agents are going to counter you on that. And then you can even say you can pay 0 points or 1 point. I would just put 0 points in there. And then the type of financing to the right, we said the default is conventional. It can be FHA or VA. And if you choose FHA or VA financing, remember the amendatory clause comes into place. And that suggests or means, and that's required, by the way, that you can't avoid that. It's required in the body of the contract, and any lender is going to require it. Otherwise, they will not go forward with a loan. But it states, and even if the buyer removes their appraisal contingency, they can still cancel based upon the appraisal if the appraised value comes in lower than the purchase price. So it is a get out of jail free for the buyer if the appraised value comes in lower than the purchase price.
And that's only when selecting FHA, right?
FHA or VA.
Or VA.
Yes. And that can hold somebody hostage because let's assume I enter to a contract and then a week later I get an appraisal and the appraised value comes in lower. Well, the seller can't cancel. The buyer can at any time up to the date of the close of escrow and say, I still am not sure, and hold up the whole transaction. They eventually could cancel based upon the amendatory clause, but they may not. And that keeps the property off the market for that entire time. So just keep that in mind. And then also the next item is FHA or VA checked, deliver a list of lender required repairs. There could be repairs required by the lender that are mandatory. And if the seller refuses to correct the deficiencies, then the lender is not going to grant the loan, meaning the loan is going to fail. And then the buyer is going to be able to cancel anyways.
Does all of that apply to contingency for loan? Loan contingency or even beyond that?
When you, well, I would
I'm
say
talking about a time frame.
the time frame. Yes. Yes.
So if it's beyond that, that we cannot use that.
No, you can't. So the contingency period for any aspect of the contract, the contingencies will live on beyond that time frame, unless you as the seller force the buyer to remove those contingencies. So remember, we may have a stated contingency period, but if the buyer doesn't comply and remove those contingencies live on. They can still cancel if they're canceling in good faith. Let's assume they don't know if they have loan approval on day 17 and they don't remove their contingencies. And then on day 21, they're denied. Well, they can cancel and will be entitled to a return of their deposit.
Even if it's beyond that.
even if it's beyond, yes, exactly. And then remember, a buyer doesn't have to remove contingencies unless the seller's provided all documentation associated with that contingency.
Mhm. Oh. I was working on one case because when it was coming to a loan, it was taking longer than that period.
Mhm.
And I was constantly getting a text from a, seller agent that remove the contingency.
Oh, yeah, if the buyer makes an arbitrary decision to remove it and subsequently they're denied the financing, they cannot cancel based upon the loan contingency.
Oh. So they cannot, even no matter what, they cannot do anything at that time.
Well, the buyer can, if they decide, I'm so confident that I'm gonna get my loan approved, and I know that if the consequences I face are that the seller is going to cancel because I'm past the 17-day contingency period, they can make that decision to remove it. Now, it's risky, and we would never tell them to remove that contingency, because if they remove it and then subsequently are denied financing, they're going to look to us to recover the loss of their deposit.
And the seller won't be able to cancel unless they give you a notice to buyer to perform to remove those contingencies. And then even then, you still have 2 days after they deliver that to you.
What is
To
the
remove
name of the
contingencies.
notice to perform?
Notice to buyer.
Notice to perform. So
And notice to perform, it's only for the loan or for any?
for any contingency,
Any contingency?
yes. So, and we'll address that as we go through it, yes, but it could be a seller contingency. So for example, the replacement of the seller's primary residence, they can make the sale of their home contingent upon a replacement property.
Oh.
And then next, this is becoming very common now, section G1, seller credit, if any, to buyer. So this is the same thing as the initial deposit. This is a contractual term. It is, the percent is not for calculation purposes. So if I increase or agree to pay 2 million versus a 1 million offered, the credit will remain the same in terms of the dollar amount. And then to the right, it specifies how those funds are to be applied. And it states closing costs, and closing costs can include recurring and non-recurring items. Title fees, for example, escrow fees are non-recurring. It could pay for property taxes and or insurance premiums also.
How about HOA dues?
Sure.
But in today's market, this is not common, right, to ask for money?
It is common.
Really?
I see it quite often, and most people are using it to buy down the interest rate. As a matter of fact, so yeah, it's becoming very common. Even though it's competitive.
I see HOA dues being asked for about on a lot of new home builds. A lot of my buyers agents, they're getting more credit than they're gonna use because they've done everything they wanted to. They're not gonna do the upgrades.
Yes, I
So
see.
they'll use them put them towards HOA.
Yeah, why not? You can pay it out for a year.
So seller credit, their purchasing price is still would be the same?
It would be the same.
The-
So the risk is the lender thinks, okay, yeah, you're borrowing $1 million, but you're also getting a $50,000 credit from the seller. Is the value there, or are you actually just trying to inflate the price so you can put down less money ultimately? So that's the risk of things like that. Is it still going to appraise? Right? If you bump it up to get a larger credit, for example, and why would people do that? Is they don't have the down payment, and it's very common in VA loans. Usually the veteran is putting 0 to 1% down, and they don't have the availability of the cash, unfortunately. So they're willing to inflate the value to get money coming back out of the loan to pay for their closing costs.
So would it be better to ask for money in an addendum?
No, the lender's going to know anyways. It won't change anything. Unless it's a brown paper bag. I've had that suggested too. Can I just give them money in a bag? No. You think it's funny, huh? So the request account for us.
The purchase price,
Huh?
the listing price,
Mhm.
it's 1-1. And I put an offer for 170.
1170 or 10?
107.
Uh-huh.
Can I can still ask for a seller credit.
You can ask for anything you want until you
Even
remove
if it's
contingencies.
lower, Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
so
You can
the
do that.
worst they say that, no,
The worst they say is
Honest
no, or they
offer.
counter it out.
yeah.
What you don't want to do is not get a counter. So that always should come into play in your decision making.
I-
And then additional finance terms, any unused, and I type this in, any unused or unapplied seller credit shall be used to reduce the purchase price by a like amount. And why did I type that in there? Because if I had a $10,000 credit, or maybe I had a $50,000 credit in there because I'm really greedy. Everybody can agree with that. Then, and maybe I can't use all that $50,000. If I can't use it, I lose it. And that's in the body of the contract that addresses that. Any unused credit is not going to be used as a reduction in the purchase price. So if you think you're being aggressive with a credit and there will be an unused credit to protect your buyer, you must specify that any unused credit will be used to directly reduce the purchase price.
So that typing is very important for buyer.
But very important for the buyer, exactly, exactly. And then section G3, this is an optional box. I don't see it used very often, but seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker. So this would take place in the event, let's say, a buyer's agent has a buyer representation agreement. And in that, the buyer's obligated to pay that buyer's agent 3%. But the amount that's being offered on the MLS is 2.5%, right? So there's a 0.5% differential. So in this case, we could check the box and say, Mr. Seller, I want you to pay that additional 0.5% that is due my agent. So that's what the purpose of this box is for. It's going to be something that's rarely ever used, I would think. Don't want to focus on it, but I just want you to be aware.
Something.
Sure, of
I
course.
hope that in future, they're gonna change the compensation for buyers. Buyer has to pay the agent.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of discussions, but I think those
hope not.
discussions are more on the fact that you can't say when you're representing a buyer that it's free to you, Mr. Buyer. So there's been substantial litigation about that because somehow the buyer's paying possibly a higher price, even though the seller is paying your commission. Now, that hasn't happened yet in regards to not being able to offer compensation. But actually, if you look at the MLS rules and regulations, which is an oddity in my opinion, it requires that the listing agent offer compensation. It doesn't specify how much, but you'll never see a listing in the MLS in which zero compensation is offered. That's a violation.
Is that very common here or no, tomorrow?
For what? It is not common. It is not
They're
common.
gonna make the seller upset a little bit.
Well, if the seller is desperate to sell their house, right, then maybe they'll do it.
No check-in.
So a lot of things are going to have to happen. That also means that buyer's agent has to have a buyer representation agreement also.
It's all depends on the situation of the
Yeah.
market.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, when this is good until you get a client, but when you get a client, why should you offer more?
No, it's not that you're offering more. It's just you have this client and maybe you don't trust them. So you have them sign a buyer representation agreement, right? Just like a listing contract, except for the buyer. And in that buyer representation agreement, it specifies that they're going to pay you 3%. But it also specifies that the buyer is going to get the benefit of an offset by the amount of compensation that the listing agent is offering to you. So let's say that buyer representation agreement is compensating you at the rate of 3% of the purchase price, and you find a home for your client. But the contractual offer of compensation on the MLS, the listing agent is paying you 2.5%. So there's a 0.5% differential, right? So the buyer has an obligation to pay that. But in this case, maybe we just make the offer saying, Mr. Seller, we want you to pay that difference. Do they agree to it or not? Just as he said, market conditions. 3H1, verification of all cash show. If you check the box for all cash, as we did at the top, it is presumed that you have attached to your offer proof that the buyer has the money. Bank statements, things like that, right? Don't get letters. Letters mean nothing. 3H2, yeah, I see lenders, well, they're just saying some company I've never heard of, an entity saying, oh, they've got the money available. Well, give me a bank statement. 3H2 verification, I'm sorry,
I'm sorry, the bank statement only for the last month or the last couple of months?
I would just ask for last month. As an agent, you're not underwriting the file to see where the money came from, so I wouldn't be as concerned about that. We just want to know now that you can ask for it, but we don't also want to chase people away. Verification of down payment and closing costs. Once again, if you're getting a loan, then you should have attached to that evidence that the buyer can go forward with the purchase. So in our case, we said we're paying $1,200,000 down. So the buyer should have documentation showing that they have in excess of $200,000 available to them. And remember, look at the name of the account holder. It should match the name of the buyer. Otherwise, it may not be the buyer's money, and they may not have access to it. Verification of loan application. So that means it's a pre-approval letter, and we can choose the boxes to the right: pre-qual, pre-approval, or fully underwritten. And the presumption is it is attached to the offer. You can check the box 3 days later. But if I'm a listing agent, I want to know you qualify now before I enter into a contract with you. Section 3J, final verification of condition. It's 5 days prior to the close of escrow. That's the buyer's opportunity to walk the property again and to confirm that the property is in the same condition as the date of the accepted offer, not to look for additional repairs. 3K, assignment request. A buyer may be listed on the purchase contract and they want to assign their interest in this purchase contract to another buyer.
I'm sorry, let me ask you a
Sure.
question, please. You know, the one that you check mark appraisal.
Uh-huh.
I was working with the agent in the past and she was saying that, you know, when she was sending an offer, she was putting that even if she's willing to get it, if it's like 10,000 less than an appraisal.
Mhm.
So in that case, they put a $10,000 there. Where did they put that?
I'll get that in just a moment. Almost there. And then assignment request. Don't ever use anyone else's assignment request. So let's assume the buyer wants to assign their interest to another buyer. The assignment request that the CAR zip form library has does not release the original buyer of their obligation to complete the contract. So we never want to be in the position where we're absolving the initial buyer of their obligation to perform. And also, if there is an assignment request, if it's me to my personal trust, then there's nothing that really the seller can do in regards to objecting. If it's me to Carlos, well, the seller would have the right then to ask for Carlos to prove that he has the ability to qualify for the purchase price before they would consent to the assignment. And then also the buyer has an obligation to disclose to the seller if they're receiving compensation for assigning their interest.
And in most cases, it's a husband adding a wife or
remove, or an assignment could be removal of something. Or sometimes people will assign I gave you my bank statements as Richard Moore, but I want to assign it to my LLC. So I could do that. Just be sure that the LLC that they're assigning it to is valid in the state of California, because people say, I'm in the process of creating it. Well, if you're in the process, then it's not valid, right? So let's not assign an interest to an invalid entity at that point in time. You just don't agree to it.
So assigning request, so if my property is under the living trust, so that's what I have to.
You could, right? It would be an assignment. Exactly. You want to sign it from you, Roya, to Roya's family living trust.
Right.
So that would be an assignment also during the purchase contract. And then let's see, loans. Well, the default time frame for the loan contingency is 17 days. If you want to say no loan contingency, you can do that. You can shorten or increase the time frame also for the loan contingency. Appraisal, and this is what you were talking about, Roya, section 3L2. Under the third box on the left, appraisal contingency based upon appraised value at a minimum of purchase price, or, so I'm offering $1 million for this property, but I want it so badly, I know it's overpriced by 200,000 and I'm willing to pay more, 200,000 more than the appraised value. I could actually say that just as long as it appraises at $800,000, I cannot use the appraisal contingency. Now, the difference between the purchase price and this dollar amount specified here is called the appraisal gap. So in our case, the example would be 200,000, a million minus 800,000. Now, if I increase the purchase price to $2 million, the appraisal gap still remains at $200,000, and that means it would just have to appraise it $1.8 million.
Then why don't you mark there is no appraisal contingency?
We can. If we don't want an appraisal contingency, we can do that also. And then keep in mind, when we specify no appraisal contingency, what takes place in an appraisal? Well, the appraiser goes out and measures the property and determines square footage. So what if the square footage in the appraisal is less than what was shown on the MLS? Can I cancel based upon the appraisal? No, you cannot. You can cancel based upon the investigation contingency, but not based upon the appraisal. The appraisal is simply an opinion of value. That's it. So we have to be careful when canceling a contract. We don't want to put our clients in an awkward position that they may lose their deposit if we're not canceling appropriately.
Every property has to be measured by an agent.
Well, if there's an appraisal, no, not by an agent.
Make sure that it's not less.
No, that's not your obligation to do that as an agent. You don't even want to put yourself in that position of making those representations that you went in and measured it. And this is what I came up with. I wouldn't do that, anything like that, nor are you required to do anything like that.
So does it list also based on the investigation, does it have some review that, if the square feet is not the same?
That it actually, if we read down in the body of the contract, it addresses the fact about the appraisal contingency and how cancellation based upon square footage falls within the investigation contingency. So just because unfortunately we're looking at this grid, it is not all telling, I can assure you of that. That's the problem that we face. We have to read the body of the RPA to really fully understand it. And then investigation of property, well, we got 17 days after acceptance. Now, this is simply, and I would feel like below, informational access to property. This is only the time frame that we're entitled to perform inspections. So after 17 days, for example, under the term of informational access to property, I don't want to give you access to the property anymore. You don't have to, but possibly the buyer cancels. Now, I'll tell you, we have come across buyers that just pencil whip sellers to death, saying, I want to dig holes in the ground. I want to continue, and say no more. You cannot enter the property any further. And then L4, review of seller documents. Well, the buyer has, go ahead. Yeah. The buyer has 17 days, the default contingency, to review the seller's documents. Now, if you notice, it says 17 days after acceptance or 5 days after delivery, whichever is later. So the contingency period is always going to be the equal or the greater of the contingency period specified here, for example, 17 days, or 5 days following receipt of the seller disclosures. So if the seller delivers all disclosures to me on day 10, what's greater, 10 plus 5, which is 5 days after delivery, or 17? No, it's 17, yeah. But what if I change my contingency period to 10 days? Suddenly it becomes much more beneficial for the buyer, because on day 10, the seller finally delivers the seller disclosures. The buyer actually has 5 more days to remove those contingencies. And then preliminary title report, no different. The contingency period is equal to the default, or the 5 days following receipt, whichever is greater. And then common interest disclosures, that's somewhat self-explanatory.
Ask a question.
Well, of course.
On J, it said final verification of a condition. But it's 5 days prior to closing. So sometimes people, they still, it's not in a good guy, or they still.
They didn't complete the repairs, for example.
Yes, or no, sometimes they still there, or, or it's not the way that you wanted it. So what would you do at that?
Well, I guess if it's a material item or not, if the stove is dirty, is that a reason to not close? No, it's not. If the stove is missing, then that's probably a material item, right? And you can say as the buyer, hey, you breached the contract, it's a sufficient amount of money for me to not go forward with the transaction. So those are options, but of course, nothing is necessarily clear cut in regards to materiality or in the dollar amount. If it's dirty, that's a problem, right? But is it a valid reason for a buyer to not close as agreed? It is not. And you could be in breach of contract if you don't close as agreed. It doesn't mean you can't use it as leverage. Or other times people, they don't empty the garage out. Well, you might just close and then you can give that buyer 3-day notice to pick up their things, or you can dispose of it. It's different than a rental, as a matter of fact, in regards to the obligations of a seller versus a landlord in regards to maintaining somebody's personal property if they vacate the premises without taking it or removing it. Preliminary title report, please read your prelims so you understand the underlying issues of the prelim. We're not going to go into a class today, but your client, your buyer might be taking that property subject to encumbrances, easements, other obligations of which they may not be aware of. So please read those underlying documents. Let's see, common interest disclosures. We should be reviewing those now that we understand those are hundreds of pages. So the recommendation to me by counsel has been look through the index and the common interest disclosures. Certain things such as occupancy or parking, things like that are very, very critical usually. Some of the standard disclosures probably don't mean as much. You should be looking through the minutes. You should also look at the financial statements to be sure that the association is properly funded. If it's not properly funded, or if it's maybe funded at 15%, you can count on your HOA dues going up and or special assessments. It's just a constant issue in regards to what's going on. Just make sure your client knows. And where does your obligation end? I haven't found a place yet where your obligation to notify them of any issues ends. And never make characterizations of information. Don't say, oh, the common interest disclosures, they're all common, don't worry about it. You don't have to be concerned. That is the worst possible thing you can say. Don't ever characterize anything to influence them. If you're trying to minimize something, don't do it. Just state it's just factual.
And don't ever put that in writing either.
And don't ever put it in writing. Yeah.
So, if I get some disclosure, would I be obligated to read it myself?
Yes, you are.
So I am obligated to read all the materials and then pass it to my client.
You have an obligation to review it with your client.
Okay. And how can I protect myself that later on the client doesn't come and say you didn't?
Well, what I suggest doing is sending an email saying, here are the disclosures from the seller. Don't sign anything till you and I personally review them. And I want to schedule an appointment with you now. If they decide to go on there and sign it, then, hey, I made the effort. I told them we need to review these together. And it's always interesting to see what reality is versus what is always recommended. And of course, legal counsel suggests that you go through each and every form, document, paragraph by paragraph. Yeah. And then it's just not plausible to go through all the HOA documents, for example. And that's why I suggest going through the index to see those things that may be more critical to help you and or your client understand the implications of, you move into a condo complex and the buyer has a big truck, but there's no place they can park it. Suddenly they can't get in the garage and they can't park anywhere on the common grounds. You think they're going to be angry? Yeah. Or the condo plan, because sometimes parking is not attached to the unit. I mean, if it is attached in a sense, it may not be the garage for that unit legally. So especially these condo plans, which there's detached parking, look at the condo plan to see it's assigned to the unit that the buyer is buying. Because who knows, someone could be renting it out saying, hey, or you can use it. Now suddenly they have possession of it.
when we are protecting ourselves, the tax doesn't apply, right? It should be.
It does, sure, if you keep it,
Yeah, so if I say that, all the tax.
yes. Actually, we're required to keep all correspondence. So that's what happens anytime there are DRES investigations. So when they come to me and make a demand for documentation, we want all correspondence.
Okay, so we have to just print it. And
We
put
should,
part
yeah,
of
we
it.
should be uploading that now. Then there's reality, right? It's very difficult to do. One of the simplest things you can do if you want to retain your correspondence, and this is not applicable to text messages, but with the with SkySlope, that's the contract management software we use. For each and every transaction, there's a unique email address. So anytime you have correspondence, you can include that email address, and everything that goes back and forth, be sure you tell people to hit reply all, and it goes right into your log. So you don't even have to do anything manually. So those are best practices. How's that? I'm going to leave it at that at this moment in time. Let's see. And then, yeah, this takes so long. And then review section L7, review of leased or lien items, solar panels, for example. That is a contingency. PACE or HERO loans. That may not necessarily show up as clearly on a preliminary title report. You should be looking at tax bills. So there are those individuals that take out financing, and the repayment of the financing is going to be clearly shown most likely in their property tax bill. And we want to be sure that, first of all, if a seller has that type of financing, they're disclosing it. Otherwise, they could be responsible, and we want your buyer to be aware. But for most PACE and HERO loans, those are obligations that the lender will not provide financing subject to, and they're typically going to require that that's paid off through the close of escrow. If there's a Fannie Mae loan, for example. Although they make mistakes too, right? And we had one example. It's always an example of everything on this purchase contract. So a quick example, a listing we had, the seller had a PACE loan on it, and it was disclosed by the seller, and we had all the necessary disclosures, but of course the buyer didn't realize that they're taking the property subject to this ongoing payment, this financing tool for home improvements.
The lender missed it too.
And the middle lender missed it too. And then of course, then the lender came back at us and said, you didn't disclose it. Well, we did in 3 different places. And we said, good luck, because that lender is going to have to buy that loan from Fannie Mae. So that's the implications. And also the buyer receives an early payoff notice or a demand to pay off the loan. So they go after all parties. You pay off the loan, you're going to actually buy that loan back from me. And then start fighting amongst yourselves. That's what it comes down to. So yeah, that's important. And yeah, what's that?
HOA.
Mhm.
If the land owner of the property doesn't pay for HOA for a period of time, right? They put a lien on it, right?
Yes.
And then the new buyer has to be aware that he owes money to the HOA and deducted in escrow.
So 2 things will happen. If it's a lien that's recorded, or maybe they obtained a judgment, that's going to show up on the preliminary title reports. And in addition to that, through escrow is going to notify the HOA or the management company of the impending transaction. And the HOA is going to send something called a demand. Just like a bank, if I'm owed money, I'm going to tell you how much I'm owed. The HOA is going to do that also.
The buyer agent is responsible to find out.
No, the buyer's agent isn't. Escrow is going to do that. In a sense, it's up to the seller to disclose all these things, but they know what they're doing. That's a good question. But these third-party mechanisms are going to protect you. Plus, the contract requires that the seller pay off all of those encumbrances unless the buyer agreed to accept it subject to those encumbrances, which we just don't see happening, right?
Okay, yes, I just want to, confirm what you're saying. Actually, 3 things we can find out if they own the money from HOA. First, from pre-lien, if they have a lien on the property. Second, so HOA gonna send us to let us know if they own the money to HOA. And third, from seller's disclosure, right? That's all
Yes.
we will know.
Yes, exactly. Does the seller tell you? Well, this gets back to Roya's question. Should I read all of my disclosures? Well, whether you're representing a buyer or seller, you should be reading all of those disclosures and you should be pointing out any errors to them.
HOA documents is kind of difficult.
Well, yeah, then sometimes the sellers don't even know that they have three HOAs and they disclose two. Then we've had a transaction close at which they weren't all disclosed. So remember, when we look at the contingency associated with a preliminary title report, it refers to in the body of the contract to those items disclosed in which the seller should be aware of and are not represented on that preliminary title report. So sellers sometimes think I can just lie and get away with it. It's their obligation to disclose anything that's not even shown on the prelim that they should have disclosed.
You know, I see often that properties have 2 or sometimes 3 HOAs.
Yes.
So why is like that?
Why is it? Well, usually there's a master area or master HOA for the common area throughout the whole community. And then the secondary HOA is to maintain the buildings for that project itself. Okay.
And they always disclose the Melrose taxes, or we should?
Yeah, let's disclose what?
Melrose taxes.
Well, yes, that is a statutorily required disclosure. It's going to show up on a prelim, for example.
So they would disclose.
Yes, they should. Right? Do they always understand? That's a good question.
Does the buyer always understand?
Does the buyer always understand? That's if we have them sign just basic disclosures talking about that and supplemental tax bills also, but do they always understand? That's a good question. And then let's see. So we talked about section L7, lease or lien items. L8, sale of buyer's property. In this case, the default is the sale of the buyer's property is not a contingency. We would check this box if the buyer to qualify must sell their existing property. Then we would attach another form. We'll go into that today. Time of possession, it's as of the date of recordation. That is the default time frame. So when it records, that's when I'm entitled to the keys. Then arguments come up if it's a rental property or the seller's remaining in possession. Well, even when it closes and the seller's remaining in possession, they have an obligation to turn keys over, unless it was documented the seller doesn't have to until they move out. Buyers are entitled to keys to their property. Seller occupied or vacant units. Well, we were just talking about that. If the seller is going to remain in possession at the close of escrow, if the possession is going to be 29 days or less, we would use a form SIP, seller in possession. If the possession or rent back is going to be for 30 days or more by the seller, then residential lease after sale. And remember, if the buyer is getting a traditional loan, the occupancy cannot be more than 60 days. Otherwise, the buyer's in default of their lending agreement. So you can't structure a lease back for more than 60 days if their property is being purchased with a loan.
You know, couple of years ago, because of the COVID, it was an article that the people, they sold their property. And the news buyer, they were so excited to come, but then because of the COVID, they stay in a property, they didn't pay the rent, and they stayed for a long time, so they were going back and forth with the legal cases. So then, you know, the 3 days that you mentioned, so is not any way we can force them to move up?
And a lawful detainer act, you have to sue them to have them removed.
I see.
That's the only way.
So you mentioned with a loan kind of more than 60 days, right?
Right, yes.
Basically, the purpose is because that considered as a rental property, not primary property. That's the reason.
Yeah, those are Fannie Mae guidelines, all right? So they give an allowance per se of up to 60 days for a rent back, but anything over that would be considered to be a non-owner occupied loan. So that would mean that the borrower lied on their loan application with never the intent of living in it, right? So the consequences are they'll call it due and payable. And they're not going to believe your excuse that, oh, we didn't intend to do that. It doesn't matter. So when buyers and sellers ask you to engage in that kind of activity, tell them no. It's fraud.
How do they know? The lender, how can the lender find out the seller?
Well, first of all, they're going to be made aware of a lease back. So that's going to be disclosed to them to begin with. And then often rents are prepaid through escrow. So it puts them on notice. Well, you know, and then of course the buyer doesn't move into their home. Where are their bank statements going? What's their mailing address? All these other nuances that would demonstrate that you never really did take possession of the property.
You have a way of finding out.
Yeah, yeah. So it's don't engage in it. Plus, we don't want to be counseling our clients, telling them to do something illegal. They're going to blame us.
Okay,
They always do,
employment.
right?
Yeah.
So your instructions to them are, you need to get out, right? Don't even engage me. And then because they'll say, well, we'll just do it afterwards. Well, I'm not going to engage in that. It's just not worth it. And then let's see, N1 seller delivered documents. They have 7 days to deliver their disclosures. Let's see, sign and return escrow holder provisions and instructions. All parties are supposed to return escrow instructions with 5 days. What if they don't? Well, the other party can give them a notice to perform, and then after 2 days passes, they can cancel the transaction. So the repercussions are pretty limited. And then time to pay fees for ordering HOA docs. Well, the seller is obligated to order HOA docs in 3 days after acceptance. Install smoke alarms, detectors, water heater bracing. Now, this is going to, all the burden of the seller is to provide certification that the property is in compliance, right? But we can specify either party can pay. If the buyer is required to pay, the buyer has to deposit money in escrow. But it's common that the seller pay for those items. And then evidence of representative authority 3 days after acceptance. So what is that? Well, if it's Richard Moore buying the property, it's an individual, it's very clear. But if it's Richard Moore's LLC, which is SC Real Estate, buying the property, well, how do you know that the person that signed the purchase contract has the authority to act on behalf of that entity? So I need to provide a copy of my operating agreement. Or if it's a trust, a family revocable trust that's buying the property, the certification of trust should be acceptable, or a copy of the trust document itself. Title and escrow are going to require those things. And more importantly, where I see this, and it just happened to me over the weekend, we took a listing and only one of the two sellers signed the listing agreement. And there's a dispute in regards to an estate sale or the decedent, so it's causing problems. So be sure you see the best thing and you get all necessary signatures.
Is it considered invalid even between spouses if you have one person sign the?
No, I'd say the listing agreement is enforceable. It's just that spouse can only sell their interest in the property. So what happens if you get the listing agreement signed by one spouse? Or in the other example, there's two competing entities for the same property, only one signs it. Well, you can put it on the MLS. So capture that MLS ID number. So you have control of that because only one person can put a listing for the same property on the MLS at one time. And then you have to disclose in the property marks that all necessary signatures required to complete the sale of property remain a contingency of this transaction. So you can qualify what you're doing there also. So if we have to get just one signature so we control the listing, then we do it.
Because we're seeing that with divorces right now.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So one of the spouses goes ahead and Mark signs a listing contract with Carlos and puts it on the market. And they say, oh, we're working on, the attorneys are talking.
Yeah.
So, okay.
That's why you have to disclose it on the MLS. So at least they're aware of the implications.
Can one spouse sell?
They're not going to be able to convey a complete interest in the property. It will not be an insurable transaction.
So they can start one sign,
You can list
at
it
the
with one.
end, you have time, the second party has to sign in this one. That's what you say.
They're going to have to sign that purchase contract. Doesn't mean they're going to agree to. And usually what happens, then the other spouse wants their own listing agent, so it becomes a.
And then they call title and yell at us telling us, why won't you close the transaction?
Yeah, well, it's always someone else's fault. And then if one listing contract is signed already by one spouse, and then the other spouse signs a listing contract with another agent, and that agent knowingly understands that there's an existing listing contract, well, that's probably an ethics violation because now you're forcing them to pay 2 commissions potentially.
Oh, so if it's one there, you cannot sign.
I suggest you don't.
Yeah.
right? Or you're gonna be fighting and then you're might be working for free. So it's a consideration. It's a everything is unique, but just to give that thought. You would have to tell the person, the second person who's signing, no, you very well could be obligated to pay 2 commissions when you're
So
doing this.
here's the trick. Remember that class for I forgot, I think it's tax, remember that time? Once you got listing agreement signed, you need to register immediately.
Immediately.
That's
That's good advice, right?
Someone, they sign another with another spouse and they sign this agreement, but we're already put on.
Is it that way with divorces and also multiple beneficiaries? or
Yes.
Successor trustees, right?
Yes.
If there's an argument within the trust.
And often there is.
Right, right. This one wants to go with you and this one wants to go with someone else.
So if you get it, you might fight for it that way too. There's something to be said for that, right?
Yeah.
And then P1, well, all these things should be included in the purchase contract, but if you're unsure, you should check the boxes to be sure there's no question what's included with the sale. And then remember, if it's shown on the MLS, but it's not in the purchase contract, it is not included in the sale. So maybe the MLS says washer and dryer, and you didn't bother to check the box, washer and dryer. Guess what's not included? And then under P2, you may want things removed from the property, so you can check the box excluded items. Q1 natural hazard zone report. It's customary the seller pay for the report, and it's customary to check the box for environmental. So the NHD report is a statutorily required disclosure unless the seller is exempt from the TDS. But then there are certain aspects of the NHD disclosure the seller still must provide. So no matter what, I always suggest providing an NHD disclosure, regardless of the seller being exempt from the TDS disclosure law or not. Pest control report, Q2, you can write that in regards to who's to pay for the report. You can specify in here that the seller has an obligation to provide a termite clearance or something to that effect. Be explicit with your language. And it would be common for the seller to pay. So what's most important, I would say, for any purchase contract, just write in there that the seller is going to provide the inspection report, because you can negotiate repairs after the fact.
So
Get the
pest-
property under control, get it under contract.
Pest control report is more than just the termite report.
For the pest control report, no.
It's the same.
It's the same. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I prefer using pest control report because that's what you're going to see in the request for repair form itself. So I prefer using similar language, same or identical. And then smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, water heater bracing. All this does is identify who's paying for it for the repairs. So it's common to seller pay. Q5 and Q6, government required point of sale inspection reports. This is simply the cost for a report. Now, depending upon the market, if it's a competitive market, I'm submitting an offer, I would check the box buyer. And same thing for Q6, required point of sale inspection. So if, let's say, for example, the water conservation and plumbing fixtures don't meet today's standards, well, if you say seller, the seller is going to have to pay to have all those toilets and faucets replaced. And if the listing agent understands what this contract's saying, they're going to counter it out anyways. So every situation is unique in regards to what you're attempting to do here. If you think that someone's going to be moving in and completely gutting the house, they told you that, then does it really matter if the seller complied with those? Probably not.
Would you please explain government required point of sale inspection report?
Sure, I'll give you an example. I'll give you 2 examples. One is in Laguna Beach. So you have to obtain a real property report. And that's required before the close of escrow, that the seller provide that for the buyer. And it's going to point out any deficiencies in the property or violations, for example, or restrictions associated with that property too. 2 cases I can specify, one in which the buyer was required to pay for the maintenance of the road. And then another of which there was an occupancy restriction limited to artists who met a certain definition in the city of Laguna Beach. City of Newport Beach, there's a city report that's mandatory before the close of escrow. So you have the choice of having the inspection performed, or you can actually pay a fee to have it waived. It's just extortion. but either you must do one of the two.
Do lenders require for their own protection, or is it just something?
No, I don't see lenders demanding that. Now, if they see it in the purchase contract, then if you put certain things in here, the lender might ask you for that
Find it out.
report. So I see people typing in the physical inspection report, buyer to pay. Well, the buyer's already gonna pay for it anyways. Why put it in there? Because if the lender sees it, they might say, I want to see the inspection report. So don't do it. Don't put it in there.
So you put seller, but you change it to buyer, 5 and 6. Which one is right?
The-
In general,
Neither one is right. And neither one is wrong. If you definitely know that the plumbing fixtures don't meet today's standards, then you could say seller to pay, but it may cause the seller to reject your offer. That's the point. Most sellers don't want to replace all plumbing fixtures, toilets, so on and so forth. So do you want to make your offer more attractive to somebody?
Depends on the market.
Then you-
Yes, exactly.
then you
Exactly.
mark buyer.
Yes, exactly. If you want to make it more attractive and make it one less thing for that listing agent to counter, or maybe counter nothing at all, then maybe you say buyer to pay. So it's part of your presentation. You just want your buyer to be aware of the implications of it.
What if nothing is checked?
Yeah, that's my question.
Then it's always open to debate and nobody is obligated to provide it. Good question.
Because I'm thinking sometimes, the only thing that happens is the house is pretty old,
Yeah.
but we don't want to check for the solver and then they just feel scared or anything. Actually, that's never gonna happen.
Yeah, and then remember San Diego County, there is a point of sale inspection requirement or performed, so you must comply in San Diego County. Orange County, it's not a point of sale requirement. LA City, it is a point of sale requirement. So you have to have a certain real property report completed and it must be in compliance before the close of escrow. So every municipality is different. There's no question about that, but Orange County is pretty standard.
So in that case, is it is it us that we order it?
No, it would be the seller who would be ordering. This is just defining who's going to pay for it.
Is that costly, by the way, in general?
Well, for the most part, in Orange County, there aren't any government required point of
Like,
sale
like
inspections.
LA or San Diego?
It can be, yeah.
Like $300-400?
Yeah, at least but the problem is all the work that usually goes into it, plus earthquake standards, things like that, glass, bars on the window.
Has to be.
It's far different in LA. Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
yeah, it's cleaner in Orange County for physically and just contractually. Yeah. You're a property owner in Los Angeles. And guess who's trying to sell now, huh? Let's see, Q7 escrow fee. It's negotiable. What's common is that we check the box each their own, always specify sterling escrow. And why do we want to say each their own? Because maybe you got a discount for your client. And if you say both to pay, you're splitting that discount. Owner's title insurance, always check the box for seller. It's customary, let's put it that way. And specify lawyer's title. What name do you think we should insert in there, Mary? Mary Block, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Is
Okay.
it mostly seller choice or the buyer?
It is the seller's
Oh.
choice. It depends, right? On the marketplace.
So we leave it open, right? The name of the title company.
You can, or you just say seller's
Seller-
choice.
Or seller choice.
You can say that, right? Or
Seller
buyer's
company.
choice, if you want to put in the name of the company.
Because we all know, normally it's a seller's choice for the title and
Mhm.
also the escrow, right? And then the other time my buyer asked me, Sunny, why is seller pick the escrow? And I paid the escrow fee too. So why they pick? I was like, what I can say? I just say, I just like a common sense.
Yeah.
What can I say? What can I say?
What can you say? Well, the seller's not going to accept your offer unless they chose the services.
Okay.
That's what I would say. So they're less likely to choose your offer if you're dictating all the terms. They already know your mindset.
But it's also dependent on the market.
Because
If it
that's
becomes
a
a buyer's
traditionary or
market,
customary.
Yes.
agents can, choose
Choose
buyers.
escrow.
Yeah, my buyers
Absolutely.
prefer to use sterling escrow because they're more, they're closer here, or whatever the reason.
Or some agents don't want to take the risk with these third-party providers they don't know.
Right.
Well, to top it off, the seller's not picking the escrow, the listing agent is.
Yeah.
So-
Most don't know,
Yeah.
don't have access to underlying services like that.
Oh, what I said is, they seller picked escrow and title.
Yeah, yeah. Somehow it became customary here. I guess control the property. That's really what it comes to.
Orange County, very
Yeah.
unique.
Yeah. And then Q10 county transfer taxes and fees. It's customary the seller pay, and that's $1.10 per thousand. In Los Angeles City, it's $4.40 per thousand. Huge.
And then some of the cities have extra.
Yes,
right?
yeah, it's as
Like
much as 5 or
Monica,
6%
yeah.
over for a 10
Yeah.
over a $10 million property. It could be as much as $600,000 on a
exactly.
$10 million property.
On the
It's
transfer.
crazy. It's theft. It's in support of homeless. I haven't seen any changes down there. So,
That what it's for.
yeah. Buy
That was
them,
the latest homeless.
buy them more tents to occupy the sidewalk. City transfer tax and fees, it's rare that we see them, but there could be outside of Orange County. And then HOA fee for preparing disclosures. It says seller, and there's a why, because it's required by law under Civil Code 4525. HOA certification fee, the buyer pays, and typically it's the lender that requests that. And no matter what, I would always want a certification, as it tells me of any pending litigation of any or any other deficiencies or infractions associated with the current property owner.
Rich, on Q15, would that include like Ladera Ranch?
That is the
Fires?
only one that I'm aware
Okay,
of, yeah.
and then how about the builders? I know we have some in Tustin where there's like Lennar's charitable transfer fee with some of the developments.
Is that something that's a recorded item against the property?
Yes.
Then yeah,
Okay, so.
So
it
there
would
are some
include
over
it
there.
as-
Yeah.
Yeah, we have some in Tustin Fields. And I think we're gonna continue to see some sporadically.
you know, I should probably look at that to really have an understanding if that's considered a private transfer fee or not,
Okay.
because it could be an area of dispute if we don't address it.
Right, because it is recorded, it's on the chain of title, and typically the sellers pay for it,
Got it.
but I don't know how it is contractually.
Yeah.
Or the seller.
Okay,
So if we don't, if we just check mark, and if it doesn't apply, so we won't lose anything.
You won't, you know,
Right.
but sometimes listing agents become very snotty as they know everything. And they'll say, why'd you check that box? It doesn't exist. So if you're not sure, check the box and say if applicable. At least put them on notice that you're aware. That's my approach.
If applicable.
okay, so for the Ladera Ranch things, we should put like a private transfer fee, right? That normally the buyer pay for it, right?
Well, actually, for Ladera Ranch, it's already, the default is in the contract that the seller's paying under
So
section
then
Q15.
Sellers pay for it.
Now, it's still negotiable, but the default in the contract is scheduled or set up such that the seller's paying for it, right?
Because if you're submitting your offer, why would you put your buyer?
No, actually, I had to do it in a ranch. Buyer pay for it.
Did
And I
they?
checked when she, the owner, because I'm listing agent. So when the owner buy it and then we go back for the old contract, so.
So that's what you said.
so
Well, that's fine.
She bought, it. she paid for it.
She did.
And then that is why we asked the buyer to pay for it, but actually supposed to seller pay for it.
No, there's no obligation, right? No,
Okay.
no.
But we should put like a Q15 now instead of Q11, right? It should be.
Well, actually, Q15 is separate and distinct from Q11. So,
What is the city transport tax fee?
oh,
What
that's
is it?
just it. Are there any city transfer taxes or fees? I'm not aware of any, but in Los Angeles County, there very well may be a city transfer
Or
tax
who's
or
gonna
fees.
pay for it most of the time?
I would say customarily the seller.
Seller, okay, fine.
That would be my approach, and I don't think that that's unreasonable.
Okay.
And then Q16, Q17, if you want to, you can put other things in there and decide who you want to pay for it. Q18, a warranty plan, and it's customary the seller pay for it, and you should put a dollar amount not to exceed. And then actually, if I'm a listing agent, I prefer that the buyer choose the home warranty company. Don't put me in the middle of it, because if you don't like it, I don't want you coming after me because they're not performing. Then other terms, it can be used for a number of things. You could say, for example, this contract is subject to, it's a contingent or subject to attorney review. You could also say that if the buyer is Richard Moore and Richard Moore is licensed by the Department of Real Estate, you need to disclose that. Actually, if you're going to be submitting an offer on a property for yourself or something which you have an interest, you really have an obligation to notify the seller before you submit the offer. But at least put it in the purchase contract.
Or if you're related to the buyer.
Yes, good point. So we're gonna go through some of the details here of,
So what doesn't make any difference from related to a buyer?
because the law requires it.
that you disclose it.
Okay, and related is it immediate family?
Oh, no, I think you should be, even if it's a cousin.
Cousin,
Mhm.
boyfriend, girlfriend.
Well, if just you're sleeping with somebody, I don't know if it's anybody's business. But, so, so I would say that's not a related party. But if you're gonna have an interest in that, let's say, whoever it is buying it and you're gonna have an interest in that entity, you have an obligation to disclose it, even if it's 1% interest. Yeah, if it's your boyfriend or girlfriend. We wanna know though, right? Okay, and then let's go through some of these things. We've talked about a lot of this already, so I will be glancing over a number of things. Section 5, additional terms affecting purchase price. Increased deposit, all cash offers, section B. I mentioned this already. If it's all cash, then there's no loan contingency. All right. And then under loans, we talked about financing. We talked about FHA, VA, or the amendatory clause already, which is a secondary protection for a buyer if the appraisal does not come in at the purchase price or greater.
So those that are buying cash, they don't have really that much of a choice to.
They can, we see it quite often. So they're gonna say they're paying cash, and then after escrow is open, then they pursue financing. But there's nothing that the buyer can, the seller can do, and they can't interfere with the transaction. But if the buyer can't get the loan, then they can't cancel based upon the loan contingency. And then the other aspect that's really important in regards to financing, you should tell your buyers. We said in this example, we're going to be putting 20% down. So your buyer better pursue financing with 20% down. If they pursue financing other than what's stated here, and they are denied financing, they can't cancel based upon the loan contingency. They decide to put less down, for example, or maybe they decide to put more down. And then also the down payment and closing costs, it is not a contingency of the purchase contract, it is a contractual covenant. So you said you're going to put $200,000 down, plus you have to add on the closing costs. If you don't have that money available to close escrow, then you're in breach of contract.
But not losing the deposit.
Well, if you can't close because you said you're putting $200,000 down, you don't have sufficient money, you're going to lose your deposit. You can bet the seller's going to fight for it and have a valid reason for it, because they relied on your representation that you had the money for the down payment.
And the seller can say, I lost my other opportunity, right?
Well, actually, if we
Because of
check,
you.
very well, exactly. That's exactly correct.
But I heard the other day in person a long time ago, it says there is a way that you can protect in worst case scenario that 3% or more deposit.
No
Is
matter
that
what.
true or not? You can do something that you don't lose the money.
Well, yeah, if you
There's a
follow
way.
the terms of the contract, if you don't release contingencies and you cancel in a good faith manner based upon that contingency, that's a valid release of a reason to obtain your money back. But if I release all contingencies and then decide, well, I couldn't get the loan after that, then that is not a good faith reason for cancellation. You gave up your rights when you release your contingency.
Yeah.
If, let's say, for example, I release my contingencies and then there is a material disclosure made by the seller subsequently that there's a crack in the slab, then I probably have a valid reason to cancel. But if that information comes to me through a third-party report, that does not open up the rescission period. So there's a big difference in regards to how those deficiencies are disclosed to a buyer. And then we talked about, section E, limits on credits to buyer. We talked about this. If you negotiate a credit, this talks about the fact that the difference between the lender allowable credits and the negotiated credit, if you don't specify, it can be used as a direct reduction against the purchase price. You'll lose it. Buyers, yes.
Question. What if you're in escrow and you removed all contingencies, but then you're made aware of another physical inspection report that the sellers that they have.
Did they
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 disclose.
intentionally didn't
Yes.
provide it? And I would say that that's a question. If it's made available to you through a third party report, but I would say also if they intentionally hid that from you.
Right.
So remember, even if they hide the report, they still have an obligation to disclose any of those known deficiencies in that report.
I think some agents are not aware or are naive about the fact that they have to disclose that.
Yeah, well, the question becomes, do I have to, if I had a transaction and the buyer performed a physical inspection and then it canceled, do I have to give the next buyer the report? No, but you better disclose any known deficiencies in that report. So give them the report, because no one is going to be able to recapture all that information in any cohesive manner to provide notice of all the deficiencies. So that all sounds like not negligence, but fraudulence possibly.
Yeah.
Let's see, closing in possession, we talk about occupancy. Somehow I skipped over something, but let's assume that you're buying the property. I did skip over this, I'm sorry. And gonna find it.
To the bottom of page 1.
Yeah, well, I wanted to get to M3, occupied units by tenants or anyone other than the seller. So if you're buying a property, so this purchase contract is not geared towards investment property. So if you're buying a property, you know, it's tenant occupied, you can do a couple things. You can use the RPA and you would check this box for tenant occupied property addendum, or you would use a residential income property purchase agreement also, which is going to better address an investment property. But you're using this contract, acceptable, you check the box for tenant occupied property addendum. This discloses, for example, what's not in the purchase contract that's in the TOPA would be, for example, allocation of prepaid rents. Or because there should be a proration of rents. You buy the property mid-October, well, the buyer should be entitled to a pro-rata portion of those rents that were paid. Talks about what's that take place with the deposit, for example. It also addresses the fact if the tenant doesn't move out, does the buyer have to go forward if the tenant's supposed to move out, for example, and what the implications are for both the buyer and seller. So those are very important aspects. And then, and Carlos, maybe help me, where is that one thing?
Bottom of page 1, right, where it says that they intend to, if it's primary or secondary.
Okay, yeah, it is. I think you're right. Thank you.
Yeah, occupancy type. It's E3, yeah, it's on page 1.
There it is. I missed it. E3. So occupancy type. The default is that it's to be primary, it's a primary residence, or you check the box for secondary or investment. On E3, yeah, occupancy type. So that should be the flag for you. And then your pre-approval letter, if you have one, it should represent whether or not it is for a primary residence or an investment property. So when you're evaluating that, terms will be different. Let's see. Yeah, good idea.
I always do that, come figure out, turn out it's like investment, it's rental, and they bought it as a primary, so that's you, it just confirms you.
And then section 7B, condition of property, the property is to be delivered in its as-is present physical condition as of the date of acceptance. So if the stove is working as of the date of acceptance, seller has an obligation to deliver the stove in that condition. And just because it's being delivered or sold as is doesn't, or give the seller still has the same obligations to disclose any known deficiencies in the property. Okay.
And so all these sections that you're talking about right now, Rich, are referenced on the first page, right? First,
Yes,
second, third
yes.
page of the contract.
So we've actually addressed a lot of those, but right, if you're looking at the grid, you can actually then look at the location of the detail underlying that information. Let's see, and then the seller has an obligation to provide all passwords, keys, so on and so forth, security alarms, system gates, things like that. And then is section 8. It addresses all contingencies in the purchase contract. So let's go through those quickly. And it talks about investigation, right? And then appraisal, we've talked about that. In this paragraph, you'll find that you can't cancel based upon the appraisal contingency if the square footage is off, right? It's only an opinion of value in which you can use the appraisal contingency as a valid reason to cancel. And then investigation of property. Well, the buyer is entitled to perform any number of investigations that don't cause damage to the property. And then review of seller documents. That's very important, obviously. Help your client review those documents so they understand it. Help your sellers review those documents also. And then talked about condominium and plan disclosures. And then review, buyer review, lease or lien items. For example, we talked about solar panels. And a removal or waiver of contingencies with an offer. You can submit an offer and have contingencies removed in advance. That's possible of doing that. And then let's see, items included and excluded from sale. So this in a sense mirrors the area above that we talked about what should be included. This talks about all fixtures that are included and those items that are not included.
So for instance, if a property doesn't get appraised that much, so, and we want to cancel it based on an appraisal, they want a copy of the appraisal?
That's the only time you're obligated to give them a copy.
Okay.
Yes.
And also if they don't get qualified by a loan, this is the same thing. You have to.
No appraisal. Remember, if you.
You have to have something from a lender, right?
Well, that's what I'm going to ask as a listing agent before I allow my seller to agree to return the deposit. I want to see that letter of declination
I see.
from a third party.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
And then excluded from sale, audio equipment, video equipment, things of that nature. If you have brackets affixed to the walls, the brackets are included. The TV would not be included, for example. Okay. And then let's say, when a request for repairs are submitted, does the seller have an obligation to respond? No, they have no obligation to respond. Keep that in mind, and that's pointed out in here. We talked about point of sale requirements, reinspection fees. Let's say, for example, the buyer is getting a loan and the appraiser goes out and the appraiser sees that their carbon monoxide detectors and smoke detectors not in place. So they're going to go out for another reinspection and there's going to be a fee. And because the seller didn't install those items before the inspection took place, seller's responsible for those reinspection fees. And then section 11, statutory and other disclosures, including lead-based paint. So these are certain disclosures in which there is rarely an exemption to. So in section 11A1, it talks about the TDS, transfer disclosure statement, NHD, and other statutory disclosures. So the transfer disclosure statement is a required disclosure. And upon receipt, the buyer still has a 3 or 5 day right of rescission after receiving the TDS, even if they removed all contingencies, but it better be a reason why they're canceling. So that means in delivery, the TDS is considered complete when the seller completes or answers all questions. The listing agent signs a TDS, and in our case, we're going to include the listing agent's visual inspection also. Upon delivery and completion of those forms, the delivery of the TDS is considered complete. And it's critical because if a TDS is not provided, assuming there's no exemption, a buyer can cancel up through the close of escrow. So sometimes sellers don't want to fill it out. Well, the repercussions are that the buyer can cancel and there's nothing that the seller can do. And then if a TDS is not required, then the buyer is required to complete an exempt seller disclosure. Excuse me, the seller is required to provide an exempt seller disclosure. If a TDS is required, the form SPQ seller property questionnaire is required contractually. So the whole goal is when you're representing a listing, get all the seller disclosures completed up front and delivered within the first 7 days. So you stay within the specific contingency timeframes. It's very important managing a transaction. And then lead-based disclosures. That is a federal requirement. So for any property built before 1978, January 1st, a lead-based paint disclosure is required. So if you don't deliver that, it could be a reason for the buyer to cancel again. And then confusion, home fire hardening disclosure and advisory in the section D, defensible space disclosure and addendum. Now, these disclosures occur in one form, in FHDS, and there's similarities between these two. So let's try and talk about where the similarities are. So these are required if a TDS is required and the property is located in a high or very high fire hazard zone. And then section D is required if, let me make sure I'm not making a mistake. Yeah, yeah. It's actually section C. And also the third requirement for section C to be met, mandating delivery is if the property is constructed before January 1st, 2010. So once again, if you don't deliver this form FHDS and it's required, it's a valid reason for the buyer to cancel. Now questions come up. There's nothing for me to fill out. Well, how do you know that actually the seller completed the disclosure? Because they sign it and they return it. That's how you know that it's been completed. So on this case, if, for example, the seller does not meet any of the obligations to complete the form FHDS, they should just simply sign it and return it.
So for number C, how should I know that it's in fire?
You'll look at the NHD report. That's the only way I know. The natural hazard disclosure. There's going to be a specific section indicating whether or not it is in a high or very high fire zone. That's it.
In another way, if the home property is close to the mountain hills, you have to go more attention on that.
Well, I don't know. Well, I'd say in any case you need to, because it's surprising just how many properties are considered falling within a high fire zone. It's very surprising.
Sometimes it's hard to get an insurance.
Oh, yeah, that's the other thing, right? And insurability is a contingency of the transaction. Also, it's part of the investigation, actually.
So can you put the insurance?
It already is. So if you, let's say, for example, but that's part of your investigation contingency. And if it's not insurable, or maybe the insurance rates and everybody's rates are going up are 10 times what you expected, it's probably a valid reason for cancellation. But obtaining insurance is getting no easier in the state of California.
Form is FHDS, no?
Yes, yes. So if there's nothing to disclose or no requirement, have your seller sign it in blank. And that also pins a responsibility for any future inspection that may be required on the buyer. Okay. And then let's see, termination rights, something that we probably talk about. Remember, you just can't cancel a contract for no reason. You should, or not should, you must have a good faith reason for cancellation. Maybe you find deficiencies in the property. Maybe there's termites and you don't like termites. Those are valid reasons. Maybe there's a nuisance in the neighborhood, your neighbor. Withholding taxes, a buyer is required to obtain from the seller a qualified substitute or an affidavit indicating that the seller is not subject to backup withholding. So remember that the buyer, once getting that form, has an obligation to keep that disclosure for 5 years following the year in which the close of escrow occurred. So if a buyer is buying a property and the person who is here does not is a non-resident alien, then backup withholding is required, meaning the buyer has an obligation to withhold from the seller's proceeds up to 15% federal tax, 3 1/3% for the state. So that could be their obligation. Escrow takes care of it. We remit the money to the IRS, but you just need to be aware of it.
So the price will be a purchase price,
On the purchase price, right?
not like capital gain, right? Just purchase price.
That's separate and distinct also. So they're going to take that money, and then the only way you recover it is filing a tax return. Yeah.
In other words, they're gonna keep about 18.5 to 19%.
Yes, it's a lot of money
How much? Yeah, from the seller,
from the seller.
non-resident, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And then we talked about condominium plan disclosures, buyer investigation of property, what they're entitled to do and not do.
About the solar system,
Mhm.
sometimes people, they have to make a payment
Mhm.
and it make it hard for the buyer. So is it possible to ask that they pay it?
You can ask that, right? For a peso or hero loan that was used to finance improvements like that. Most likely, it's gonna have to be paid off if there's a lender involved, assuming they don't make a mistake. But for the most part, most solar leases tend to be assumable. And then remember, the transaction is subject to buyer's approval of the preliminary title report. Right? We don't want to take on any unknown obligations. And if there's past due taxes, recorded encumbrances like unpaid HOA dues, the seller has an obligation to pay those at the close of escrow. And then time periods, the contingencies. So remember, the default contingency timeframes were specified in the grid. For the most part, they're 17 days. So if the buyer does not remove their contingencies within that time frame, the contingency lives on. If they have a good faith reason at any time, they can cancel based upon that contingency. You can request repairs. The seller has no obligation to accommodate any request for repairs. But if you're going to cancel, you better have a good faith reason. And if we cancel, the only thing we're going to do for the most part is specify paragraphs 8 and 12 of the purchase contract. We're going to give them an obscure response in terms of the reasons. We're going to make it as broad as possible in terms of the reason for cancellation.
I closed on a transaction where the buyer never removed contingencies, and we sent like 3 or 4 notice to performs. And we were just like, God, we hope this closes. And it closed. I mean, there wasn't any problem, but still.
But yes, you can close a transaction without removal of contingencies. It just, they possibly could cancel up to the very end.
And inspection report is a good reason to cancel.
Yes. Usually if you find deficiencies in there, you want something more than just one item. We want to have multiple items, so there's never a question. Now, for the most part, I encourage most sellers to just move on. Don't fight to get the money from the buyer. It is a fight and it costs them more money. And they're going to be limited to the amount of liquidated damages clause, if assuming that is checked by all parties. And if it's not liquidated, subject to liquidated damages, they're going to actually have to prove the damages. So that means most likely having attorneys involved. And let's say, and it talks about the rights to cancel. Well, the seller, once the seller's under contract, the seller is hostage to the buyer. They really just can't cancel. The only reason they can cancel is if they follow along the time frames, if the buyer doesn't remove the contingencies within the required time frames. And if the buyer is not removing those contingencies in required time frames, what the seller can do is send a notice of perform to the buyer indicating you have 2 days following the receipt of this to remove contingencies. So remember, yes, go ahead.
By the way, for 2 days, is that come as a holiday or Saturday and Sunday?
It does, but if the execution of the event falls on a weekend or a holiday, then it falls to the following business day.
We have more time.
You have more time. So if you issue that notice to perform on Friday, they actually have through Monday, even though the second day falls on Sunday.
Pretty much all the term is including holiday and Saturday. and Sunday.
Yes, all the terms
Pretty
when
much.
after contract execution. Before contract execution, like the offer can expire to Sunday. So it's always after contract execution when we count in that manner.
But after 2 days, yes, they can.
Then the seller could cancel in our example, but the seller doesn't have to cancel, but it gives them the right to cancel then.
Gives the buyer a little nudge.
It does, you know, and so we try to avoid doing that because it makes people angry. But but if you're gonna have to do that, so you do have to protect your seller. Every transaction is different. Just let the other agent know, look, hey, you haven't removed contingencies, you promised you would. It's company policy, we send you a notice to perform. And then let's assume that all contingencies have been removed and the buyer's not closing on time, or maybe the seller's refusing to sell the property. We've witnessed that also. Well, what can the party do? They can serve a demand to close escrow thereafter to try to force the cancellation. But they have 3 days, the other party has 3 days after receipt of the demand to close escrow to perform. And then final verification of condition. Well, remember you're there to be sure that the property is in the condition in which you originally found it and any negotiated repairs are completed. That's the purpose of that. And it talks about prorations of property taxes, so on and so forth, broker's compensation, and the most important part of the contract, Joint escrow instructions, I'm gonna just skip over that. And then we talked about assignment. There's a 17-day time frame on the contract, and now I'm referring to section 23 of assigning my interest in the contract to a third party. And then the definitions are very important. Acceptance means the time the offer or final counteroffer is fully executed in writing by the recipient party and is delivered to the offering party. So the buyer submits a purchase contract today, the seller signs today, but the seller doesn't deliver it back till next Monday. Next Monday is the date of acceptance. So the date of delivery is the date of acceptance. What if they hold it for a month? Is that fair? It's all backdated. Yeah, it's the date of delivery. Agent self-explanatory agreement, purchase contract, and all addenda as is. Just talks about the condition of the property. That's it. Seller has an obligation to disclose any known deficiencies in the property.
So Rich, in the case of them holding the acceptance for a month and then delivering it, then it's no longer the 3 days, right? You have 3 days.
If it's expired,
Yeah,
right?
it's expired.
If it's expired. That was an
But if
extreme
they decide to
example.
move forward with it, then as long as both parties.
Yeah, also Carlos's question is, I submitted an offer and it expired 3 days following delivery to the listing agent. And then a week later, the seller responds, is it a valid contract? No, it's not at that point in time. It's actually considered to be a counteroffer, or by the seller in that case, once it expires. So you should have something. And here's what I suggest. If you're going to respond to a contract that's expired in your counteroffer, just extend the expiration date of the original contract. Say it's extended to October 31st. So you can address it that way so there's never any question.
The buyer has the option, right?
Yes,
Go for it or cancel.
yeah,
But has
exactly.
to
Once
send
it's
something.
expired, yes.
Even though he say, hey, call the agent. It's okay, I accept it, but still has to send a letter counter offer that I accept this date.
Yes,
Has to be
exactly.
in the piece of paper, read it.
Yes.
Richard, I put an offer and I didn't hear anything from the agent. And so after 2-3 weeks, I saw that it was sold.
Mhm.
Shouldn't I mean,
You and countless other people.
Yeah.
It's very unfortunate to not get a response. Sometimes listing agents, I've witnessed them have been overwhelmed with the number of offers that they've received. You're entitled to ask them in writing to confirm that they did indeed deliver that purchase contract to the seller.
I asked, she didn't even answer.
Did you ask for her to deliver it in writing?
No, I wrote an email that this is it, please just, let me know if it any question. I texted her and she got an offer,
I understand, yeah.
But nothing happened after.
Yeah, you need to say specifically, it doesn't mean she's gonna comply. I need to know in writing from you that you did deliver that purchase contract.
Oh, to a client.
Yes, and actually, if I'm a listing agent, I'm gonna take that initial page, the last page of the purchase contract, and have my seller initial it. The listing agent can actually respond and say, I did deliver it, right? I acknowledge delivery, but people lie. What if you're questioned, and you never did deliver it? So that's risk that a listing agent takes by not delivering it when asked to provide evidence that they did.
Can we prove it or not deliver?
On the listing MLS,
Mhm.
it said that the listing agent has a relationship with the seller.
Mhm.
So maybe that's why she got it and she didn't.
Well, I don't think that's anything in her defense. Maybe that gives you some insight, right? Or she just probably did not promote your listing. Whether she
Yeah.
presented that or not, I don't know.
Okay, but we always have to ask for it. In that
Yes,
sense.
if you want confirmation that they delivered it or you didn't get a counter offer, then yes. But they have an obligation to respond. And what I can say, you wanted to know if you can prove it, very difficult to do. I've been in countless hearings and that is not one subject that's ever come up in regards to an ethics complaint that they didn't deliver it. So it's so hard to prove. That's the problem.
There is a problem, they have to fix it in future.
Yeah.
They must disclose all the
They're
Offers.
offers, yes, they have an
But
obligation.
sometimes they say, no, this is no, I want.
Yeah, you have an obligation, even though there's acceptance, to continue to disclose any and all offers. You have an obligation to disclose verbal offers. Doesn't mean the seller's wanting to entertain anything like that. And the seller could elect, if they got a much better offer, they could elect to cancel the existing contract and be in breach. That's up to them. So the only time you have no obligation to continue providing offers that are received is if the seller gives you written instructions to no longer provide me with those offers. Let's see, liquidate.
That would be in a, the response would be in a format of an email or something, a form with the end.
It's the very end of the purchase contract. That's really what we want initialed.
Oh,
That's what we want initial. Liquidated damages, it is not a part of the contract. It's optional. So when your clients receive electronic documents for signing, the fields you're looking at in section 29 are optional fields. If all parties to the contract do not initial the liquidated damages clause, liquidated damages are undecided at that point, and it requires a counteroffer to address whether or not that they're to be included or not included in the purchase contract. Now, the counteroffer has default language in which it states that if all required initials to the contract are not initialed, then it's excluded. So remember, if all parties don't initial it, it's not included in the contract. And
Any breach damage, not included.
well, just the liquidated damages clause, because liquidated damage is saying the initial deposit not to exceed 3% is the maximum damages that the buyer will incur, the buyer breaches. Liquidated damages are not applicable to the seller. So other forms of recourse are available to the buyer against
How
the
about
seller.
sellers? Default, seller. Buyer has a right to liquid
So-
damage.
No. The liquidated damages clause does not
It's for
fit.
deposit only,
It's if the buyer breaches the contract,
buyer, not the seller.
not the seller, exactly. And then if it's a primary residence, liquidated damages are limited to 3%. If it's an investment property, there's no limitation. So keep that in mind
So it
also.
benefits your client to initial this.
It does. I think it does. They should agree to that. And we've had sometimes attorneys that don't want to agree to that.
So it's okay to see not sign or initial, or it must be initial both sides.
If it's not, they're not initial on both sides by all parties, then it's not included.
We cannot enforce. Just
Correct.
initial it.
If there's two couples and only 3 of those 4 people initial, it's not included. So the language is explicit. Arbitration, once again, an optional clause, so could be more cost effective as opposed to just full litigation. So of course, we're always asked, should we initial that? We tell them what to do. It's giving legal advice. I suggest that they initial it. It simplifies the process in regards to contractual disputes. And then expiration of the offer. And it refers to section 3C, and 3C is 3 days, right? So section 32A, expiration of offer. And then entity buyers, this simplifies your life. If you have an LLC, for example, that is buying the property, that's the name of the buyer, then you can insert the name of the manager in here and the manager's title. So it could be Richard Moore there, member or manager in this section. It could be the Richard Moore Revocable Trust, that's the entity, and Richard Moore would be signed here, and trustee would be signed here. So anytime Richard Moore just signs the name Richard Moore, it's deemed to be signing in the capacity as trustee or member when using this paragraph. Otherwise, it may not be enforceable if they're not signing in the proper capacity.
What about if a person is cognitively impaired?
Then you better have somebody else that's signing that
It's
contract.
also signing here that, someone needs.
Well, there's going to be a court order administration of the estate if they're
I see.
cognitively impaired.
So an LLC can't sign for a purchase contract, it has to be the representative capacity.
It has to be the individual that
manager.
has the authority on behalf of the LLC. So you can put the name of the LLC as the buyer, but it's going to be Richard Moore as the name of the person who has the authority to sign on behalf of the LLC.
So trustee,
Or a trustee of trust, yes, sorry.
This is a very simple question. So if the buyer is under LLC or as a trust, so when we write an offer, so we put LLC as a buyer, or we put who sign authority.
At the top of the purchase contract, the buyer's name is going to be the LLC.
Not someone. Who
And
is-
here in this signature block, it is going to be the individual who's signing on behalf of the LLC.
Okay, so I should buyer's name should put like LLC or the trust. On
Yes,
the purchase.
yes.
Okay.
Another word on the purchase, buyer has to trust family, husband, wife, they're on trust, right? They have to write in a person. But
Yes,
buyer's
their
name.
individual's name, comma, trustee.
Husband name, wife name, / trustee.
You could do that, right? That's another way of doing it. So
Or
as
that's the
just as long as
same
it's
thing.
clear that they're,
It has to be person. Name.
whoever has the authority, right? In this case, usually it's the trustee, and we have to identify them by their titles. Because if they sign as an individual, then let's assume they just put the offers under the name of the trust, and then they just come down here and sign their individual names without designating them as the
Whatever.
trustees. It may not be an enforceable contract because the individual can't represent the trust, the family trust. It's the trustee that can represent the family trust.
But you don't need that defined somewhere else, it's just defined right here.
It can be simply defined here, but in other cases, it's not defined. Let's assume that you're the seller, you're representing the seller. You may have to have something called a representative capacity signature disclosure, which then defines all the parties and the individual that has the authority to sign on behalf of that party.
Escrow gonna ask for that. Right?
Escrow's not going to ask for that. You're going to ask for that.
I remember when I opened a transaction, I remember escrow asking me like some statement, like who is authority.
They want evidence, but realistically, you already know that escrow and title are going to demand those documents. Because escrow and title title's not going to ensure that transaction.
Without backup documentation.
Yes.
Should
Yeah.
have it because the lender also asked.
Well, that's already a different issue, because usually lenders are not going to lend to an entity anyways. So that's probably not, sometimes they'll lend in the name of a family trust, but other than that, it's rare. As a matter of fact, usually they won't even lend in the name of family trust. So you have to record it in the individual's names and then deed it to their trust afterwards. That's typically what we see. And then let's see, so we talk about acceptance. If we're going to issue a counteroffer, we want to check seller counteroffer. Be sure to check that box, please. Otherwise, someone might contest whether or not a counteroffer was issued. And then the other things that I see sometimes people will submit just a counteroffer to the buyer. So the buyer submits an offer. The seller gets the offer, and then they just send a counteroffer, but they don't sign the purchase contract. Now, if I'm the buyer getting that back, a counteroffer without the underlying purchase contract, I'm going to have questions. So be sure that the seller signs and returns the purchase contract.
We added a counteroffer. We need to check that box, let them sign this, and also the counteroffer.
And I don't know if somebody else has modified what's on that contract without getting it back in my possession. Nobody should ever be going back and modifying a document, but I've witnessed that happen. And then let's see, seller signature, right? So signatures for the clients. And then we talked about confirmation of agency at the very beginning of today's discussion. So in this area, under section 5, agents, signatures, and designated electronic delivery address. So a couple things. The agents who are agents to the transaction, we're not parties to the transaction, must sign here, and this completes confirmation of agency. And then the designated electronic delivery address.
I'm sorry, you mentioned that we have to check mark the seller counteroffer
If you're going to be issuing a counteroffer.
if I'm issuing.
Yes, if not, no reason to,
If
correct.
you're representing the seller.
And then, so you're signing, and then designated electronic delivery addresses. Obviously, as an agent, you never give your clients contact information out. But the other side is hard to believe. Sometimes there are agents in this world that aren't responsive, or they go into hiding, or they claim they didn't receive documents, right? So the only way to confirm that somebody has received a document you sent to them, maybe it's a cancellation of contract, is to use this box for the designated electronic delivery address. Because the contract states, if you give me this information, anything I have sent there is deemed to have been received by you. And that's always critical in any kind of a discussion, is receipt of the documents that you claim to have sent. So it eliminates the ability for somebody to hide and say, I never got that. Right here, 5A, yeah, designated, there it is. Electronic delivery address. I'll check it again for you.
Just check them off.
Check that box and put in the email address.
What address? Oh,
Whatever address that you want to communicate with the other agent. That's what we want in there.
Yeah, and the email address is already up there. Richard. More.
Yes, just insert it here, right?
Please read it there.
Yeah, that's what I would do. I'm not making this easy, but anyways, I would say.
You also have to repeat it.
Right there.
And
You have to read,
there.
you don't have to, but
Yeah.
it just, if you use the cover sheet, it's gonna be populating the field above anyways, but it's not gonna pre-populate the designated electronic delivery address. So two different things there. And then escrow typically will acknowledge this page and send it back to you. And what you should be looking at is the acceptance date. So be sure that the acceptance date is the date that you were aware that delivery took place.
Which we want to check the box for email for the other agent as well, right?
We do. Yeah, actually, what I prefer doing is not giving them my email address, but getting theirs. That's my approach. And then, Raya, you asked about presentation of offer. Let's assume you're concerned and you don't believe they presented the offer, and you ask them in writing to prove that they didn't deliver to present the offer. Have them initial this section. Yes.
But most of the time, I mean, the offers and agents don't never, they never respond.
They don't respond, yeah.
And later on, I just feel like, oh, they're yes, well.
Yeah.
They don't respond. You said that you can present the offer in person to the buyer, right? To the
Yeah,
seller.
well, you do have the ability well, that's a different issue. So if you submitted an offer and you can't get a hold of that listing agent, after 24 hours, you actually had the right to contact the seller. Yeah. But usually what we do, we'll notify the other broker and say, hey, not responding, we're going to be contacting your client directly. So the MLS rules and regulations give you the right to do that. That's going to make people angry, but sometimes doesn't matter. Yeah, it just doesn't matter.
I heard that you can offer and it says 24 hours acceptance. right?
After. No, I'm saying I've submitted the offer, but that listing agent for 2 days, nothing.
Doesn't respond.
It is not responding.
No, what I'm saying is that when you offer, you want to answer within 24 hours. You can do that.
Well, the default time frame for the response is 3 days. You can shorten it to anything you want.
But he has the right 3 days.
Well, if that's the default time frame for the expiration date.
Contact seller means go to their house, not their door.
Yeah, that presentation of the offer and the time frame in which the seller has to respond are two different things. So the expiration date in the contract just means if the seller hasn't responded in that time frame, the contract has expired. My offer is no longer valid. But delivery or presentation of the offer by the listing agent to the seller, that's a different issue.
You can do that when you don't see any response from agent. And yes, I showed or no response.
Yeah, if they're not responding to you and you want, because sometimes buyers, they'll look at you and say there's something wrong with you. And they're gonna start blaming you for
You
not
as
getting,
Agent, seller.
they're gonna, no. The buyer's agent you're the buyer's agent, they'll start blaming you. Because they start losing out on multiple offers and they think you're the one who's inadequate.
You submit the offer.
They don't believe you.
You have a
Or they think
document,
that you have
send it,
done
you
something
email
wrong.
them.
I'm just telling you what we see all the time, right? You can argue with me all day long.
No, you
Yeah.
email, is
Huh?
a document you have that you email them?
Yeah, but then they
that's
think,
not
what aren't you
enough.
doing to get them to accept my offer? Why aren't you getting them to respond?
Especially when buyer, they're really, angry because you submit a lot of offers.
Or if they feel
market-
like they did a strong offer.
Yeah, and
Yes.
then you just nothing heard from them, and they're blame you, cause you're the one, who.
They could have 10 other offers that are $100,000 over yours, over the one that you submitted for them. They're still gonna be upset thinking their offer is the best one. Why didn't they accept it?
Yes, it's interesting how people act.
Yes.
They don't listen to your advice, and then they have you submit an offer, and then they're not awarded the offer. You tell them you need to bid $100,000 over the asking price. I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
Then they lose 10 or 20 offers, and it's still your fault. So,
Richard, is beautiful is, it's good things to let the buyer know that I did this, no response. You have to communicate all the time. I'm
yes,
doing my best again.
you do that, right, I think,
He's gonna be
right,
happy or she's gonna be happy.
Mhm.
You do your best.
yes. Yeah, you keep them apprised. I think that's the best way to avoid any implications or any
That you're working
negativity.
hard for them,
Yeah.
even though you don't get response.
Richard,
Yes.
to show our property last Saturday. And, on MLS said that the owner, I have to go through the agent because owner live in a property.
Mhm.
And, so waited all week until Saturday that, if it was possible to go. And when I texted the agent, she didn't get back to me, so I texted them, nothing, then I called. And you know what she told me? She said, are you willing to put more than the listing price or not? If
Mhm.
not, I don't want you to come and stay.
Well, that's a violation.
Oh, that's.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. For telling someone you can't see the property
If
unless
they
you.
want more, they should list it for more.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's just so crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think people understand the number of violations that they create, and it requires you filing a complaint against them. That's kind of what it comes down to, unfortunately, but yeah, that's a violation, or you see people who are saying they put it on the market as active. No showings until next Saturday. Well, that's a violation also. It's not an active listing. Coming soon, you can't show the property.
Can't,
You cannot.
No.
You cannot even show it to your own clients if you have buyers.
But if you do, you have to change the status.
To active, within 24 hours, correct. And you hear it all the time, but other agents are policing what you do. They see your sign up. And if you don't have that on the market within 1 day, they're gonna file a violation against you, and then you're gonna pay a fine. Or you're gonna have to prove that you did somehow put it on the market and you weren't marketing that property.
So if you have two buyers, as you said, you cannot show same property for both of them.
Oh, yes, you can. Now, we're saying that if the property is in a so-called registered status, a coming soon status,
Or you cannot show.
you cannot show the property, right? That's all.
But if you're representing two buyers, can you put two offers?
Absolutely. That's why you have them sign the representative, the PRBS, possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. And that's included with the purchase contract, the listing contract, so they already signed the disclosure.
Buyers and let them whatever they want.
You can, yeah, sure. You can do that. Yeah, take as many as you want. So that's the end of my discussion today.
That was a lot.
Yeah.
That's what I do. Every time I learn something new, RPA. Every time I learn something new.
Oh, good, good.
Good. There's one question I asked you, but I didn't quite understand. So if I'm presenting a buyer, okay, so she wanna put on LLC. So let's say the lady, she is authorized to sign up. But how could I know she is? I remember it's Expo, they asked her for like a statement, she need to fill it out. And then that's the way how we know, because she just addressed, she is a signer.
So
Yeah.
Is there any way we will find out she's a signer or not?
Go ahead, Sarah, you were gonna answer?
So there is some document, it's bylaw or the company resolution, something to show that she is one of the-
Operating
yeah.
So you
agreement.
mean like we
Yeah.
should ask for that document?
Absolutely.
You should. It's for LLC, it's the operating agreement. That's the only authoritative document that's
Can
gonna
you say
dictate.
it one more time? What's the name of that?
For an LLC, it's an operating agreement.
Let me see, operating agreement.
If it's for a trust, a family trust,
And then.
it could be a certification of trust or their actual trust documentation itself.
So we have to ask for that one, no matter what, we have to ask.
You're gonna
that
have
one.
to get it. I think from my perspective, I would say to them, okay, if it's a family trust, usually if it's a couple, most likely it requires the authorization of both. So you should question them, right? If only one's signing, oh, I can sign. Even simple things like a lease agreement, landlords, some family trust. I see it often. Only one of the trustees on behalf of the property owner signs. Well, is that a valid lease? Even if it's a divorce situation, suddenly the other trustee is contesting it. So in a lease situation, all parties required to sign should be signing. So if it's, and then if it's an S corp or a C corp, a corporate resolution,
So as an agent, we should
Corporate
find,
resolution.
we should find out, as an agent.
you should ask them exactly if they're submitting an offer as an LLC, okay, who has authority to sign on behalf? And then what you don't know is, does it require the authority of more than one individual in an LLC? It could require two people, it could require three.
Sometimes they don't even know, so you present it to them like you're trying to, you are trying to protect them,
Yeah,
right? So you
absolutely.
say, we should go over this to make sure
And I
that there's
have
no,
one.
right. Like right now, one of the things I'm seeing a lot of is LLCs members are actually trusts, so it's a second layer.
And then a second layer, so that
Yes.
means more documentation, yeah.
And oftentimes, these sophisticated investors are doing what their CPAs or attorneys tell them to do, but they don't even recall that,
Yeah.
right?
I believe it.
So they say, oh, I'm CCY LLC, and tries to sign it, we get the operating agreement, and it's like, okay, well, this is owned by Carlos and Richard's trust.
Yeah, if it's a selling, all parties have to sign, but for a buying, purchasing, it's the, and it's also depending on how it is.
Well, if it's a buyer, likewise, if it's a family trust, all
Buyer.
trustees of the trust, if it's required, must sign. It doesn't mean they're not gonna be obligated, it just means there's gonna be trouble.
Yeah,
Because if one of the trustees is now refusing to sign that purchase contract.
so it doesn't matter if they are a purchaser or seller, they all have to.
They
sign.
all have to sign, correct? Same thing with disclosures.
And title is
Richard,
almost
if-
always asking for it.
Two people, one resident, one non-resident and not living here. But they're putting together money and they want to buy investment or something profit.
Mhm.
At the end, first they can do that because they
Sure.
open a company or name.
Sure.
At the end, when they sell it, as you said, they're gonna verify who are the owners, right?
Mhm.
Trustee or LLC.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
not gonna care about that second person is not living here.
it doesn't matter where they live, but that second person could be subject to backup withholding. So they could be subject,
The money together.
it doesn't matter, it's gonna be on a pro rata interest. So let's assume one's a non-resident alien and one is a resident.
One person.
Yeah, so if the selling price is $1 million, let's say 2 million, it's easier for me math wise. $1 million is gonna be allocated to both party, and the individual doesn't have a taxpayer ID, is gonna have backup withholding of 15%
Of half of it,
of half of it, and 3 1/3% of the half, exactly.
but it's possible, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
Because the resident can get loan, non-resident has no right to get loan, like the resident.
Yeah, that's
That's one
just
of the
something,
reasons.
but keep in mind, in that case, I suggest always notifying the lender if you're saying the resident's gonna get a loan. And then they're gonna put the other person on title after the fact. If they do that, valid reason for the lender to call that note due and payable. Because they've transferred the original owner that's on the loan and on title, it's transferred a portion of their interest that violates the deed of trust. So we just witnessed one recently, as a matter of fact. It's very interesting. Let's see what's going on.
It's happening more and more.
It is. People do
used to
that
be able
among,
to get away with it before, right?
yeah,
It
it's a-
didn't matter,
yeah.
but now for the lenders, if they have a 3% loan out there right now and someone violates it, they call the loan, demand the balloon payment, they can go resell that for double.
So when she says 3% of these people that took out these low interest rate loans, I'm gonna watch you carefully now. If you violate it, I'm definitely
Yeah.
going to call.
The
use
only time it's not a
acceleration clause.
violation is if it's between husband and wife, but if it's, and it could be adding someone, it could be someone coming off.
Yeah.
Both directions.
Yeah. And then as you pointed out before, if changes that occur after the close of escrow, well, title insurance may be impaired now.
Mhm.
So you may lose coverage from title insurance or your title insurance policy. It's a new owner.
The owners change. Title insure the person that was on the original purchase.
But if you go from a husband and wife to their family revocable trust, the proportional ownership interest has not changed. So that's not going to be a violation.
So Rich, in that situation that you mentioned where it was the LLC and then it was owned by the trust. So how would that be, how would you sign that? How would it still be a trustee?
Of the, whatever the trust name is,
Mhm.
trustee of, right? First of all, my capacity, I'm a member, right? Richard Moore, comma, member, exactly, the, whatever the trust name is by Richard Moore trustee.
Wow.
Okay.
So that's what I would envision,
Yeah, that's exactly how it is.
So why would somebody do that?
because they're trying to shield themselves from litigation.
Okay.
Protection from investment. funds.
Yeah, or maybe they'd use it as an investment vehicle to go into different LLCs.
Mhm.
But isn't the form the representative capacity signature disclosure why that defines who is the managing member? So you get them to sign that saying, I'm a managing member of this LLC and that kind of.
All
That's what
it,
I've done for leases.
yeah, all it really, it, in a sense, does, it doesn't confirm it. All it does is say that if I just sign as Richard Moore now, it's known that I'm signing in this other capacity. It just simplifies the signer's life. That's all the RCSD does.
It tells people what his title is. That one time.
So I don't have to re-sign my title over and over again, even the initials, because if I'm a trustee of a trust, it should be RM, comma, TTE.
Um,
So it simplifies that whole process, actually, when someone I just have to sign my name and everybody now knows because they've signed a document indicating that everything I sign on this transaction is in the capacity of trustee or manager. That's all.
What should, I mean, how the client knows that if they transfer their title, it's demandable or not?
If it's defensible or not,
If they have to pay it, yes.
You mean if
Pay
the
yourself.
loan's gonna get called?
Yeah, if the loan is their cost.
they have to look at their deed of trust. I would say if they convey any interest to any third party, it's a conveyance that's against the deed of trust, which is the security instrument providing the collateral for the lender, for providing that loan.
So it's in the deed of trust.
Yes, it's the acceleration.
9% of the time,
Yeah.
it is a violation of the deed of trust to transfer title.
And it's called the acceleration clause. That's what you find in the deed of trust.
Based on a gift, you give it to somebody.
Right, but it's not allowed.
Oh.
It's never been an issue. Oh, I shouldn't say never, but
Yeah.
it hasn't been an issue, but I'm entitled and we are seeing that at a very, very large rate right now. We're getting a lot of calls from people.
Yeah.
And then they want to reverse it and
And you can't, it's
you
too
can
late.
put the deed back, but you've still already violated you've already received an acceleration clause letter.
Yeah, before it wasn't a big issue. Now.
Right.
It's becoming an issue. So yeah, we never want to suggest it.
What's the consequence for that?
You have to
Pay the loan
pay
off.
the loan off. You get 60 days to pay the $600,000 balance off.
Well, you can't refinance it, right?
Well, you can refinance it.
Maybe.
Today's rate, so that's
Correct.
why
Today's rate,
Correct.
exactly.
we're doing. There's no
Correct.
motivation.
And that's what they say. They say basically, we can refinance you in just this new name. These are the new borrowers, or you have 60 days to give us our balloon payment. We demand $604,000.
Or we can foreclose.
Yeah.
That's the worst
What
circumstance.
do you see, like, they ask you to, a lot of people doing that, so have you ever seen, the acts to pay it off? Did that
Yes.
happen all the time?
That's exactly.
That's what I'm saying. It's happening much more often now.
In the last 6 months, I've had more than 5 calls.
Wow,
Yeah.
Wow.
that's a
Um,
lot.
Yeah.
4 of the calls were for the deed of trust of
Mhm.
people going in and out of title. One of them was a borrower who bought last year and he made an error. Essentially, the lender saying you lied on your application.
Mhm.
He did not disclose that he was buying a car. And the lender found out after they closed that the guy actually closed on a car
Before the.
a
close
day
of
or two
escrow.
before, but it was just based on a few days gap. It was a $900,000 loan, so he has 60 days to pay it off. He got an attorney, but he didn't win.
But my question is, how could lender know about it?
The buyer has an obligation to disclose it.
And the
Credit
lender, when you say,
Yeah.
how does the lender know about it? You have access to property
Dramatically,
files. Why do you
yeah.
think Bank of America doesn't?
Um,
Right? So Bank
Yeah, they
of
may not
America
qualify,
lends
yeah.
out money to different houses. All they have to put is those 100 APN numbers and any deed changes or any changes, they're triggered on it. Just,
Once you change the deed, the title, And I mean, the title change and then they
Right.
trigger.
They're
everything that-
notified.
Yep, they're notified. But like in this guy that bought the car, the way he got caught is because they were selling the portfolio.
And they audited the
They
file.
audited the file, so the lender was in trouble. I mean, he was asked to
Yeah.
cough it up if the borrower would.
Oh, yeah, they go after
Right.
everybody.
So they got an attorney, but he unfortunately didn't win.
But yeah, the loan application indicates you must disclose anything that's known or unknown.
Right,
in
even
these
if it's not
third-party reports.
showing,
Yes.
You're supposed to
Yeah.
say, I don't know when this is gonna
Yeah.
close, but I'm buying a car.
But there is no data that they can find out from computer that he's borrowing $30,000-$40,000.
It doesn't hit the
Purchase
credit
report.
report quick enough.
Sometimes it doesn't.
Oh,
hit.
it's not like a same day, like a.
But
stock
the
market.
lender may not have run the credit report a day or two before the close of escrow. It was after the close then that they did an audit of that file. He just got lucky. and
The
it was
reason I
full.
say that, everybody probably knows that, because they're accusing Trump, for example, for his asking the bank, the value of the property is 2 billion, he asking for 4 billion. And because they know each other, they loan that amount, 4 billion, because he wants to get a loan. But everybody says, hey, it's Trump, I don't care about Trump, but he is defaulting and he's
Yeah, but the
lying and
bank-
everything.
The bank
To
sends out an
me, it's
appraiser, though.
the bank is the fault too.
Well, they send out if someone to
They
appraise the
let them
property,
know.
they don't just lend you money because you say
They
your
didn't
property's
appraise
worth
it.
that
They
much.
didn't appraise it.
Are we done?
Yep, we are done. Yes.
What I'm trying to
Well, thank you for coming, everybody. It's good to see everyone out
say,
there.
Richard, if somebody has a property, right? And he's going to have a quit claim with somebody